Thank you for joining me today. History does not always unfold in neat, predictable chapters. Sometimes it bursts open with moments so powerful that they alter not only politics but also the very consciousness of people around the world. Today we are living through one of those moments. The headline reads, "Israel blockade collapses! Palestinians rejoice as aid ships arrive." That is not just a headline, it is a signal that years of suffering, resistance, and international pressure have converged into a profound turning point. The collapse of the Israeli blockade stands as a historic breakthrough, one that cannot be understood simply as the loosening of restrictions at a border or the docking of a few aid ships. It represents a seismic shift in the political, humanitarian, and moral landscape of our time. For decades, the blockade was seen as immovable, a symbol of entrenched power and the harsh reality of geopolitical stalemate. It became synonymous with despair, a policy that reduced an entire population to conditions of dependency, scarcity, and suffering. And yet, against all odds, this structure has begun to crumble. And that collapse is not just material, it is symbolic. It is the collapse of a narrative that sought to normalize exclusion and collective punishment. It is the unraveling of a policy that assumed human endurance had limits, that believed solidarity would fracture, that thought despair would silence a people forever. History has now delivered a different verdict, and it is one that should command the attention of the world. When we call this a breakthrough, it is not an exaggeration. Think of the countless international resolutions passed and ignored, the humanitarian convoys turned away, the protests dismissed as marginal, the journalists silenced or discredited when they dared to expose the human toll. The blockade seemed eternal, like an iron wall against which every effort at resistance shattered. But history teaches us that no system of oppression is eternal. Apartheid once seemed permanent in South Africa. Colonial empires once looked unshakable. The Berlin Wall stood for decades until suddenly it did not. And here, too, the image of ships filled with aid breaking through a blockade once considered impregnable offers a powerful reminder. Human resilience, combined with mounting international outrage, can topple even the most entrenched barriers. Let us place ourselves in that moment for just a second. Imagine standing on the shore as those aid ships approach. Picture families who have lived through years of scarcity and indignity, watching containers of food, medicine, and basic goods arrive, items the rest of the world takes for granted. The tears, the cheers, the flags waving, the chants of joy, they are not merely emotional reactions, they are political acts. They say to the world, "We have survived, we have endured, and now we are seen." That visibility is as important as the aid itself. For too long, Palestinian suffering was framed as invisible, as collateral damage in a larger geopolitical chess game. But the collapse of the blockade rips away that invisibility. It forces the global audience to look, to listen, to reckon with a reality that has been suppressed for years. The hooks here are undeniable. If a blockade that lasted for so many years can collapse, what else might follow? What other so-called unshakable structures of domination are vulnerable to the same fate? What other peoples who are told to wait, to endure, to accept the unacceptable might soon find that their moment of breakthrough is closer than anyone predicted? These are the questions echoing not just across Gaza and the West Bank, but across every movement for justice worldwide. This moment transcends geography. It speaks to a universal truth: oppression can delay freedom, but it cannot eliminate it. Politically, the symbolism of this event reverberates far beyond the Middle East. Allies and critics alike are forced to recalculate their positions. Governments that once justified or ignored the blockade now scramble to explain how something so necessary could unravel so quickly. International organizations that issued report after report with little impact now see the possibility that their words, combined with grassroots activism, were not in vain after all. And most importantly, ordinary citizens across the world, those who marched, donated, spoke out, and refused to let this issue fade, can now point to this moment as proof that sustained pressure matters. This breakthrough is not just about relief goods landing on a dock. It is about breaking the logic of hopelessness. For years, the blockade thrived on convincing Palestinians and the world that resistance was futile, that nothing could change. Its collapse punctures that illusion. It reminds us that history bends not toward despair, but toward the possibility of justice. And that is why this moment, fragile though it may be, carries immense power. It is a warning to those who cling to outdated strategies of domination. And it is a spark of hope to those who have lived too long in the shadows of oppression. The arrival of aid ships into Gaza is more than the transfer of supplies from one place to another. It is a humanitarian victory of profound proportions, one that carries both emotional and political weight. For years, the blockade not only sealed borders but also sealed off hope. It rationed life itself. Food, medicine, and clean water became tools of political control. To see vessels filled with humanitarian relief pierce through that blockade is to witness not just the delivery of goods, but the reassertion of human dignity. It is a moment that compels the world to ask, how could such basic necessities have been denied for so long? And why did it take so much suffering for this breakthrough to occur? To understand the scale of this victory, we must remember the daily reality faced by ordinary Palestinians. Hospitals were starved of medicine. Clinics lacked electricity to run equipment. Children went to school hungry, and families lived under constant fear that even the simplest of resources might run out. In that context, every crate of food, every box of medicine that comes off those ships represents a small piece of survival reclaimed. But the deeper victory lies in the symbolism. The world did not look away forever, and the walls of isolation could not hold back the most fundamental of human rights, the right to live. The joy captured in the faces of families as those ships docked is not just relief, it is vindication. It is the living proof that endurance has meaning. Picture mothers holding their children aloft as aid finally arrives. Fathers breaking down in tears as medicine for ailing relatives is unloaded. Children laughing because they can finally dream of a meal beyond ration lines. These images are not merely snapshots of happiness. They are political statements. They challenge the notion that suffering populations are powerless. They affirm that resilience, when combined with solidarity, can bend even the harshest of blockades. Here is the hook that makes this moment impossible to ignore. Humanitarian aid is not just about calories or syringes. It is about narrative. For years, the story was written by those enforcing the blockade, framing Palestinians as dependent, dangerous, or invisible. But when aid ships arrive, the story shifts. It is no longer about control. It is about the undeniable humanity of a people who refused to disappear. The act of receiving aid becomes an act of reclaiming voice, of saying to the world, we are here, we matter, and our suffering is not a bargaining chip in someone else's politics. Politically, this humanitarian victory also forces difficult questions upon those who stood by as the blockade endured. Nations that justified silence must now explain why they allowed children to go malnourished, why they watched hospitals run out of medicine. International institutions, often paralyzed by vetoes and power struggles, must reckon with their failures to act sooner. And ordinary people everywhere are reminded of their own role. That sustained protests, donations, campaigns, and calls for justice do add up, even if the payoff feels delayed. The collapse of the blockade and the arrival of aid ships is, in part, a testament to the countless unseen acts of solidarity that kept the issue alive in the global conscience. Economically, too, this moment matters. The blockade was designed to suffocate not only people, but an entire economy. It sought to make development impossible, to create dependency as a permanent condition. By breaking that blockade, aid ships do more than feed the hungry. They crack open the possibility of a functioning economy once again. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and doctors who were forced into cycles of scarcity can now glimpse the return of stability, however fragile. The psychological impact of that hope is as valuable as the physical supplies themselves. The hooks keep coming because the symbolism is so rich. If ships carrying food and medicine can reach those shores today, what might follow tomorrow? Could this be the first step toward broader exchanges of goods, of ideas, of cooperation that rebuild the bonds between people long divided by politics and war? Could this humanitarian breakthrough trigger the political will to pursue something larger than aid, something resembling justice and peace? These questions are now unavoidable, and they create a sense of possibility where, for years, only despair lived. In the end, the humanitarian victory of aid ships arriving is not about charity, it is about rights. It is about restoring to a people what was denied to them for far too long. And the greatest power of this moment lies in the way it shifts the horizon of imagination. It tells Palestinians that survival was not in vain. It tells the world that solidarity has consequences. And it tells history that even in the darkest of circumstances, humanity can break through walls meant to contain it. Global solidarity has always been the invisible force behind moments of profound change, and the collapse of the Israeli blockade is no exception. The arrival of aid ships was not an isolated act of generosity. It was the culmination of years of organizing, protesting, lobbying, and speaking out across the world. This humanitarian breakthrough did not occur simply because a few ships set sail. It occurred because countless voices refused to be silenced, because ordinary people in distant countries marched in streets, pressured their governments, and demanded that the suffering of Palestinians could not be ignored indefinitely. Without that solidarity, the blockade might have endured far longer, continuing to grind down lives in silence. Instead, global outrage became a current too strong to contain. pushing through cracks in the wall until it finally collapsed. The hook here is clear: when people across the globe unite around a common cause, even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be shaken. Think of the movements that shifted the tide of history. Civil rights struggles in the United States, the fight against apartheid in South Africa, the protests that brought down dictatorships in Latin America and Eastern Europe. In every case, local resistance was amplified by international solidarity, creating a moral pressure that no regime could withstand forever. The Palestinian struggle, long painted as a regional conflict, has now been placed squarely within that lineage. The cheers that erupted when aid ships arrived were echoed far beyond Gaza. They were felt in the chants of demonstrators in London, New York, Johannesburg, and Jakarta, who for years carried signs demanding an end to the blockade. This victory belongs to them as well. What makes solidarity powerful is not only the scale of participation, but the persistence. Governments and institutions often bank on fatigue, expecting global audiences to grow numb to suffering as headlines fade. But solidarity movements refuse to let Palestine disappear from the global conversation. Year after year, activists organized boycotts, built coalitions, held vigils, and shared stories of ordinary families under siege. The emotional connection they fostered prevented the blockade from being normalized. It is one thing for a government to defend a policy in front of diplomats. It is another to face public outrage at home when citizens refuse to accept complicity in suffering. That moral discomfort, multiplied across nations, became a political force, and it is part of what made the collapse of the blockade inevitable. We should not underestimate how much courage it takes for individuals thousands of miles away to tie their reputations, careers, and sometimes safety to the defense of people they have never met. Journalists risked censorship and career backlash to tell the truth. Students organized campaigns on campuses despite pressure to remain silent. Faith leaders invoked moral responsibility even when their congregations were divided. Every one of those acts of solidarity, however small, added weight to a global demand for justice. And when history looks back at this moment, it will not only see ships breaking through a blockade, it will see the power of a collective conscience breaking through the barriers of indifference. Here is another hook to consider: solidarity is contagious. Once people witness that their voices can lead to change, they are emboldened to act again, and others are inspired to join. The success of pushing humanitarian aid into Gaza may now energize other movements that seek justice for oppressed populations worldwide. What happened here is more than a local victory. It is a reminder to every person watching that collective action is not futile. It is proof that even when power appears invincible, the weight of global humanity can tip the scales. Politically, the role of global solidarity in breaking the blockade also exposes the limits of state power. Governments that maintained or tolerated the blockade must now contend with the fact that their positions are no longer tenable in the eyes of their citizens. Public opinion has become a battlefield, and solidarity has shifted its balance. Countries that once felt secure in offering blind support are now forced to recalibrate, realizing that international legitimacy depends not only on military or economic might, but on moral perception. The collapse of the blockade was not just about ships, It was about the crumbling of global silence. In economic terms, solidarity also disrupted the blockade's logic. Boycotts, divestments, and sanctions created costs for corporations and governments tied to the policy of isolation. While critics dismissed such actions as symbolic, the reality is that economic pressure works slowly. Like water eroding stone, over time, companies reconsidered their contracts, institutions debated their investments, and the narrative of profit without consequence began to unravel. Those seemingly minor shifts, multiplied over years, helped create the conditions in which sustaining the blockade became not only politically embarrassing, but economically unwise. The lesson here is profound. The collapse of the blockade was made possible because solidarity transformed from sentiment into structure, from compassion into action. It turned outrage into pressure, and pressure into change. And the hooks it leaves us with are vital. If the blockade of Gaza can collapse under the weight of global solidarity, what else might crumble next? What other injustices that seem permanent are, in fact, brittle under the strain of sustained moral resistance? And what responsibility do we carry as witnesses to this moment to extend that same solidarity wherever human dignity is denied? The blockade on Gaza was never just about borders or checkpoints. At its core, it was an economic weapon designed to suffocate life itself. By cutting off trade, limiting imports and exports, and restricting access to essential goods, the blockade transformed the economy of Gaza into a system of controlled dependency. Farmers watched their crops rot because they could not export them. Fishermen were barred from their own waters, their livelihoods stripped away by naval patrols. Small businesses that might have grown into engines of stability were stunted before they could take root. The blockade aimed to starve not just stomachs, but ambition and hope. Its collapse, therefore, is not only a humanitarian relief, but also an economic rupture with enormous implications. It represents the breaking of chains that tied an entire people to a state of forced stagnation. What makes this moment so significant is the way economics reveals the truth of political policies. For years, the blockade was defended under the guise of security, but what it produced, in practice, was mass unemployment, chronic poverty, and a shattered economy incapable of sustaining normal life. The truth is that economic strangulation was used as leverage, an attempt to make daily survival so difficult that political concessions might eventually follow. Yet the opposite occurred. The blockade's economic cruelty became its own undoing, exposing the hollowness of claims that such measures could ever bring peace or security. Instead of weakening resolve, it hardened it. Instead of silencing resistance, it amplified it. When people have nothing left to lose, they become impossible to control. That is the paradox of economic oppression. And it is a paradox the world has seen play out time and again. The hook that emerges here is powerful. Economies cannot be indefinitely imprisoned. Just as water finds cracks in stone, human ingenuity and resilience find ways to resist suffocation. Underground markets emerged, tunnels were dug, informal trade networks grew. Families adapted in ways that exposed both the cruelty and the futility of the blockade. And every attempt to tighten control only revealed the desperation of the policy itself. When aid ships finally arrived, they did more than deliver goods. They punctured the illusion that economic warfare could be sustained forever without collapse. Consider the broader consequences for Israel and its allies. Blockades are not cost-free for those who impose them. Policing borders, enforcing restrictions, maintaining naval patrols, and dealing with international condemnation required immense resources. Over time, the costs of enforcing the blockade began to outweigh the perceived benefits. Global boycotts and divestment campaigns targeted corporations and governments complicit in sustaining the policy, eroding profits and reputation alike. International trade partners began to calculate the reputational risk of association with what was increasingly viewed as a humanitarian disaster. The economic consequences were not limited to Gaza. They rippled outward, undermining Israel's standing in global markets and forcing uncomfortable debates in parliaments and boardrooms around the world. The hook here is one of irony. What was intended as an economic stranglehold on Palestinians became, in time, an economic liability for Israel. The blockade, meant to showcase control, instead revealed vulnerability. Every report on malnutrition, every image of bomb factories and idle farmland became not just a moral indictment, but an economic one, pressuring partners and investors to question their involvement. In this way, economics acted as a mirror, reflecting the unsustainability of a policy built on suffering. On the Palestinian side, the collapse of the blockade does not mean instant prosperity, but it does open the possibility of recovery. Farmers can dream of exporting their crops again. Merchants can imagine filling shelves without fear of shortages. Doctors can envision hospitals supplied with reliable medicines and equipment. Every crate of goods that moves freely now is also a signal that rebuilding is possible. And rebuilding economies is not simply about income, it is about dignity. It is about people feeling that their labor has value, that their communities can sustain themselves, that they are more than victims of a political stalemate. That psychological shift is perhaps the most transformative economic consequence of all. What happens when an economy long suppressed begins to breathe again? That is the hook that lingers. Will industries revive, creating jobs for a generation raised under siege? Will young people who saw only barriers begin to see opportunities? Will international investors step in, reshaping Gaza not as a symbol of despair, but as an example of resilience? These are questions no blockade could answer, but their possibility now hangs in the air. The economic consequences of the blockade's collapse ripple far beyond Gaza. They serve as a lesson for every government that believes it can weaponize scarcity without cost. They remind us that economic oppression is not a sustainable strategy. It corrodes not only the lives of the oppressed, but also the legitimacy of the oppressors. And they reaffirm a simple truth: economies, like people, demand freedom to thrive. When denied, they resist. And when finally liberated, even partially, they reveal just how fragile the architecture of oppression truly was. The collapse of the blockade is not only a humanitarian and economic shift, it is a political earthquake whose tremors will be felt across the region and far beyond. For years, the blockade was a cornerstone of Israeli policy, a visible demonstration of control and a tool to shape political outcomes by force. Its sudden unraveling exposes the fragility of that strategy, and in doing so, it reshapes the balance of power in ways no one can afford to ignore. Political structures often rely on the illusion of permanence. The blockade looked permanent, like an iron lock on Palestinian life. But its collapse shows that political power built on denial and repression carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. This is the first political repercussion, the recognition that domination can collapse not from external conquest, but from its own contradictions. The second repercussion lies in the new questions this collapse poses about sovereignty and legitimacy. For Palestinians, the breaking of the blockade is a symbolic affirmation of their right to exist as a people with dignity and self-determination. Every aid ship that enters their ports becomes a political act, declaring to the world that their needs cannot be forever subordinated to the strategies of another state. For Israel, however, the blockade's collapse represents a loss of leverage, a tool once used to control negotiations, to pressure Palestinian factions, and to assert regional dominance has suddenly slipped away. Without that instrument, Israel faces a profound political dilemma: how to maintain its narrative of strength when one of its most visible symbols of control has disintegrated. The hook here is dramatic. When a blockade falls, it is never just a wall of ships or barriers that collapses. It is the political architecture built upon it that begins to crack. This is why the world is watching so closely. Other governments see in this moment both danger and opportunity. Regional powers that once hesitated to challenge Israel openly now sense that the political landscape has shifted. If the blockade can fall, perhaps so too can the assumption of Israel's unassailable dominance. Nations long criticized for remaining silent may now seize the chance to position themselves as champions of humanitarian and political justice, reshaping alliances in the Middle East and beyond. At the international level, this collapse forces a reckoning for the institutions that tolerated the blockade for so long. The United Nations, the European Union, and the United States all face mounting pressure to explain why they allowed a policy widely condemned as collective punishment to persist. Politicians who defended the blockade as a necessary security measure now find themselves cornered by the undeniable images of joy and relief as aid ships dock. Their arguments crumble in the face of reality, and public opinion increasingly demands accountability. The political cost of silence has risen dramatically, and governments everywhere are recalculating their positions to avoid being on the wrong side of history. The hook that resonates here is that political narratives are fragile when confronted with undeniable human truth. For years, the story of the blockade was one of security, necessity, and control. That story worked only as long as Palestinians remained invisible behind walls and restrictions. The moment aid ships broke through, however, another story emerged, one of resilience, humanity, and liberation. And in politics, stories matter. They shape public opinion, influence policy, and determine legitimacy. The blockade's collapse shattered the old narrative and replaced it with one that empowers the oppressed. That narrative shift may prove more politically destabilizing than the physical collapse of the blockade itself. Domestically, within Palestine, the collapse of the blockade also carries political repercussions. It strengthens those who argued that persistence and resistance would yield results, and it weakens those who claimed the world had abandoned them. Leaders who can now point to aid ships as evidence of progress gain credibility, while those who appeared ineffective in the face of the blockade may lose influence. This shift in internal dynamics could redefine Palestinian politics, strengthening calls for unity in the face of external pressure. It demonstrates to ordinary people that collective endurance has meaning, and that political agency is not an illusion. Regionally, the political landscape is also being redrawn. Arab nations that normalized relations with Israel in recent years must now justify their decisions to their populations in light of a visible humanitarian breakthrough for Palestinians. Citizens in those countries who long expressed anger at normalization may now demand stronger commitments to Palestinian rights. This could place governments in uncomfortable positions, forcing them to balance their diplomatic interests with the renewed energy of popular movements. At the same time, countries sympathetic to Palestine now see an opening to expand their influence by stepping forward as defenders of this new political reality. The political repercussions extend even to global grassroots movements. Activists who campaigned for years to highlight the injustice of the blockade are emboldened by this victory. They now have proof that their voices matter, and their confidence will likely translate into broader campaigns for justice, not only in Palestine but across the world. In this sense, the blockade's collapse is not only a local political event, but a catalyst for global political activism. The most striking hook in all of this is that political power, once thought to be absolute, is revealed to be temporary and contingent. A policy that endured for years, defended by powerful governments and enforced by military might, has collapsed not through brute force, but through the combined weight of resistance, solidarity, and human perseverance. That truth carries consequences far beyond Gaza. It tells every government, every political leader, that the foundations of their authority are never as stable as they seem when built on the suffering of others. The collapse of the blockade and the triumphant arrival of aid ships may feel like a definitive turning point, but beneath the celebrations lies a deeper truth. The future remains profoundly uncertain. History rarely moves in a straight line, and moments of liberation often carry within them seeds of both opportunity and danger. For Palestinians, the joy of relief is real and undeniable. Yet it is accompanied by the knowledge that this breakthrough could either open the path toward lasting change or be followed by new forms of repression. That uncertainty is not a weakness of the moment. It is a reality of politics, where every victory immediately generates new struggles over what comes next. The first dimension of this uncertainty lies in the reaction of those who enforced the blockade. Will Israel accept the collapse as irreversible, or will it seek to reassert control in new and harsher ways? History suggests that when a tool of domination fails, it is often replaced with another. The risk of retaliation is real, whether through military escalation, new restrictions, or diplomatic maneuvers designed to restore the leverage once provided by the blockade. This looming possibility casts a shadow over the celebrations, reminding everyone that breakthroughs are not permanent unless they are defended politically, diplomatically, and morally. At the same time, uncertainty also emerges from within Palestinian society. Relief brings hope, but it also raises expectations. People who endured years of deprivation will now demand not only survival but dignity, opportunity, and progress. Political leaders will be pressured to translate the symbolic victory of aid ships into tangible improvements in daily life. If they succeed, the collapse of the blockade could mark the beginning of a new chapter of empowerment. But if they fail, if the arrival of aid is not followed by systemic change, frustration could replace hope, and internal divisions could deepen. The future hinges on whether this breakthrough becomes a foundation or a fleeting moment. There is also uncertainty in the international arena. Governments and institutions that tolerated or supported the blockade for years now face a choice. Will they adjust their policies to reflect the new reality, supporting long-term reconstruction and meaningful negotiations, or will they simply treat the aid ships as an exceptional moment, leaving the underlying conflict unresolved? The world's response will matter greatly. If global solidarity strengthens, it could sustain momentum toward lasting change. But if international actors retreat into old habits of silence or double standards, the risk of reversal grows. The question is not whether the blockade collapsed, but whether the world will allow the forces that sustained it to reinvent themselves under a new guise. Here lies a critical hook. Uncertainty is not only a danger but an opportunity. The future is unwritten, and that very openness means that choices made now carry extraordinary weight. The collapse of the blockade has shattered the illusion of permanence. It has proven that even entrenched systems can fall. That revelation energizes movements for justice, reminding them that change is possible. But it also warns that victories can be fragile. What follows depends on how forcefully people, both locally and globally, seize this moment to demand more than symbolic breakthroughs. Will this be remembered as the beginning of the end of oppression, or as a brief interruption before new forms of control took hold? The uncertainty also stretches into the realm of regional politics. Neighboring states are now compelled to respond, balancing domestic public opinion with diplomatic calculations. Some may see opportunity in supporting Palestinians more openly, while others may fear destabilization or confrontation. These competing interests create a volatile environment in which the direction of events is difficult to predict. The collapse of the blockade could catalyze a wave of regional solidarity, or it could spark rivalries as states maneuver to shape the new political order. For Palestinians themselves, the uncertainty is perhaps most profound. Young people who have grown up knowing nothing but siege now glimpse a world of possibilities. That glimpse can inspire innovation, creativity, and hope, but it can also fuel impatience if change does not come quickly enough. The challenge is to channel newfound optimism into constructive political, economic, and cultural development. That task is daunting given the scars left by years of isolation, yet it is precisely in times of uncertainty that the seeds of transformation are planted. The hook that lingers is this: uncertainty is the price of possibility. Without it, nothing changes, but with it, everything is at stake. The collapse of the blockade has thrown open the doors of history, but what lies on the other side is not yet clear. It could be a path toward justice and peace, or it could twist back into repression and conflict. That ambiguity is both frightening and exhilarating. It forces the world to confront its own responsibility, and it challenges Palestinians to decide how to shape their future now that survival is no longer the only horizon. The ships have arrived, The blockade has fallen, but the story is still being written. And let me close with this thought. History will not remember today's moment as merely a logistical breakthrough. It will remember it as a moral breakthrough. It will remind future generations that human solidarity can outlast siege, that justice can break through walls, and that the joy of a liberated people is more powerful than any blockade. The question now is, will the world build on this momentum to ensure a lasting peace? Or will it squander this chance and allow new walls to rise? That answer is not written yet. It is ours to decide. Thank you.